3, 2. Today I'd like to talk about humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology is quite a bit different than the others that we've been talking about. In the first place, humanistic psychology takes into account more of the intangible things that are associated with people, how people perceive things, how people feel about things. Humanistic psychologists said these are important and should not be ignored even if they cannot be quantified. Which leads to the problem of how do you verify? How do you verify how someone's perception of an event influences their behavior? This would be like trying to prove the unconscious in Freud's perspective. That Freud would say, well, you're doing this because there's something in your unconscious that's in conflict and we need to get to that. But how do you prove it? There's really not a way. Which means that humanistic psychology, to some extent, I guess you could say it's a matter of faith. You can't measure it as much. You can't quantify it as much. One of the other major tenets of humanistic psychology is that people are basically good, and given to their own devices will want to do good. If people are not doing well, they just need to grow more. They need to expand their horizons, so to speak, to look at new possibilities where they might be afraid to do that. One of the things that humanistic psychologists talk about is human growth. If things are not going very well, then you just need to want to change. And the thing is, they believe you really want to change. They talk about change, and you really want to change. You just need to be guided in how to do so. Hello, and this is the introduction to humanistic psychology. I'm not going to read each one of these lines in each one of the slides since there are so many things that I have written. Please use the pause button and scan these yourself. Humanistic psychology is related to existential philosophy. That means that you have the ability to be whatever you wish to be. You are not predisposed to any particular thing. If you do not like what you are, you can simply change it. You can simply become something different. These are some researchers that you may want to look up. I'm going to be talking about Maslow and Rogers probably in a video. I'm not going to spend too much time here, even though I do have slides about them. Historically, humanistic psychology begins with Gestalt, which is viewing a person as a whole, or that is viewing things also as a whole. You are not the sum of your parts. If you see 3 dots and they're in a triangular shape, then you would see not 3 dots randomly placed, but you might see a triangle. Also of note here is the inclusion of quote-unquote healthy lifestyle, things like diet, exercise, meditation, quality time alone, whereas other perspectives did not particularly take this into consideration. Humanistic psychology is primarily a therapy-based theory, as far as I'm concerned. That there was not a lot of in fact, I don't think there was any animal research. There was no clinical studies, so to speak, not in the experimental sense. That these people, these like Alport, Maslow, and Rogers, were thinking up things, trying it on their clients, and then deciding whether it worked or not. Please note synergy and the relationship between the person, community, and society. What I would like to talk about now, just briefly, are the two researchers, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Maslow is the one that's a little bit, I think, more well known for his hierarchy of needs. This is the pyramid where self-actualization is on the top, and I think its biological needs are at the bottom. His idea was that you can't, which makes sense, you can't try to be all you can be, to be self-actualized, if there are other things standing in the way. If you're poor, if you have to work all day just to find food, then it's going to be hard to work on social and emotional issues. It's also going to be hard to self-actualize. One of the other things that Maslow said is, if self-actualization is what everybody really wants, and in fact needs to be, why don't all people become self-actualized? This is called the Jonah concept. And his idea is that people are afraid to grow. People are afraid to step outside of what they're aware of, what they know, what they feel comfortable with. And hence, they don't oftentimes work quite so hard to become self-actualized as they might otherwise. What I would like to talk about now is Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is much more associated with actual therapy, doing actual therapy. He also believed that people were basically good. He talked about unconditional positive regard, meaning not that you give someone props for something that is inappropriate, like fighting or arguing, but to focus always on good things that a person is doing. For example, maybe someone's on parole, or maybe someone is an alcoholic. They say, oh, I had a relapse. And the idea is not to say, oh darn, you have very weak will, that's why you relapse, but to say, good for you for noticing that you need to continue to work on fill in the blank, whatever that thing is. One of the other things that Carl Rogers talked about is the phenomenological approach, meaning I react to things that happen in my environment. Those things that happen in my environment affect me and will mold me to some extent. For example, a person has a very bad childhood, then they may see in the adult world, I have to fight for everything. Everything is a battle. Nothing that I need will be easy. Versus someone who grew up maybe very wealthy and very, they didn't have to work very much for anything. That their worldview is going to be completely different than somebody else's. And I think really that the general thrust with Rogers is simply empowering the self. The more that I convince you that you have the power to change yourself for the better, the more likely it is that you will do that. Talking about humanistic psychology, I just wanted to show you how humanistic therapists view 1, 2, and 3, just for your personal information. These are the kinds of tools that humanistic therapists might use. The only ones I'm going to talk about are like the first and the last two. Encounter groups could be something like AA meetings, NA meetings, but it could also be something like sensitivity training that is talking about sexual harassment, how to talk with coworkers, any number of things. Down under therapy, where it talks about empathy, this is very much used sarcastically when people say, oh, I know what a therapist says. They say, and how does that make you feel? But that is not quite accurate. A humanistic psychologist does not want to say, oh, I feel so bad for you. Oh, just tell me everything that you feel. They want to see how this person is feeling and that you react appropriately to that, not slathering them with praise unnecessarily or giving them a lot of sympathy. which ties into the last one, authenticity. That is, you should be as real as possible. If something the client says upsets you, you might ask them, how do you think other people react when you say these kinds of things? And if they really are being honest, then you appreciate that. This is Maslow specifically. In the last slide, it talked about the hierarchy of needs, which is what Maslow is normally known for. But here we have the personal orientation inventory. And interestingly, the Jonah complex. This is where a person may decide not to succeed, to foil themselves, because they are in fact afraid of success. This is Carl Rogers. Both Maslow and Rogers were therapists, and most of what they tried to do is to get people to grow in their life, to develop the idea that you should be all that you can be, and that if you are not, something must be holding you back. Incongruence, meaning that if a person is not able to reconcile reality with how they see themselves, that's why people become mentally ill. And probably the largest one here is the drive from an internal locus of control, external, to having an internal locus of control, meaning that the person feels they have more control over their lives. This is what both Maslow and Rogers specifically stated about healthy people.